Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to open our event tonight, a hybrid book presentation with book author Pamela Cooper-White and discussing Michael Freund. And I would like to warmly welcome our two speakers and all of you here in the audience here at the Library of Psychoanalysis of the Freud Museum in Vienna. And I would also like to welcome our participants via Zoom. Pamela Cooper-White, who is one of the most interesting and inspiring and interdisciplinary and open-minded Freud scholars I ever met, really, and I met a lot, will present her newest book, which came out only a few months ago in the United States. It's a book she was invited to write. Given the fact that Christian nationalism, which is a dangerous anti-democratic populist movement, is on the rise. In her lecture today, in the presentation today, Pamela Cooper-White will focus on the unconscious motivations and explore the reasons why so many Christians adhere to this program with Freudian psychoanalytic theory that is thinking about depression, identification, Narcissism, group psychology. Why people are drawn in and how to talk across the divide. As the subtitle already tells us, Pamela Cooper-White is also interested in overcoming the polarized situation and in asking if, and this is important, under which conditions it could be possible to enter in conversation, in dialogue with these Christian nationalists. Conversation, dialogue, this is also a key word for our event tonight. I'm really very happy, Michael Freund, that you joined us on rather short notice. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
So after Pamela Cooper-White's PowerPoint presentation, after the discussion on the podium, of course, you, the audience, here with us, and we assume you can share your thoughts with us and ask your questions. But let me now briefly introduce our two speakers. So Pamela Cooper-White is the Christiane Brooke Johnson Professor of Psychology and Religion, and also the former Dean at Union Theological Seminary in New York. She's also a licensed psychotherapist. She's also an Episcopal priest, and she's also an expert on Anna Schoenberg. PhD from Harvard University and the Chicago Institute for Clinical Social Work. In 2013 and 14, and that's how we met, she was the Freud Fulbright Scholar of Psychoanalysis here in the Freud Museum, working on her book project, Old and Dirty Gods, which came out in 2018. 1 year later came out her other book, Sabina Spielrein and the Beginnings of Psychoanalysis. And in our library, and we are of course also making some publicity for our library, in our library you can find 4 more books of her, all classified in the section 71, which is Religion and Theology. These books are Graded Selves, Collected Essays on Multiplicity, God and Persons, 2011, then Many Voices, Pastoral Psychotherapy and Theology in Relational Perspective, 2007, Shared Wisdom, Use of the Self in Pastoral Care and Counseling, 2004, and The Cry of Tamar, Violence Against Women and the Church's Response, 1995, and a revised second edition in 2012. So as you already have seen with these titles, her publication and research focus are the history of early psychoanalysis, the psychologies of religious, political, and gender violence. She is also a member of our Freud Foundation US, a member of the Psychology, Culture, and Religion group of the American Academy of Religion. She is a member of several editorial review panels, and she is also the president of the International Association for Spiritual Care. And Michael Freund, who joined us tonight, is a freelance writer and a lecturer at the Institute for the International Education of Students here in Vienna, and also at Webster University Vienna. He studied social science in Vienna, Heidelberg, and New York. He was the head of the Webster media department and editor and head of the album department at the Austrian newspaper, the daily newspaper, the Standard. Thank you very much. I will now give you the word. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you have an interesting evening.
Thank you, Daniela. So, to begin, on January 6th, 2021, as recapped so vividly by the recent US congressional hearings, and by the way, the last one is happening even right now as we are here together, a violent mob attacked the US Capitol in a shocking effort to stop the certification of the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Members of the crowd, many heavily armed and wearing military fatigues, broke through the inadequately guarded barricades, scaled the walls of Congress like commando fighters, and shattered doors and windows to enter the US Capitol, causing deaths, injuries, and sheer terror throughout the building. Deep in the midst of this mob was a loose-knit band of religiously motivated individuals who see themselves as devout Christians. On display among the crowds during the attack on the Capitol were numerous flags and signs with "Jesus saves" in bold letters, and other Christian symbols proudly displayed alongside numerous blatantly racist ones, including a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of Congress. A photo that went viral showed a group of men before a 7 or 8 foot high cross, I'm estimating, one with his forehead pressed against it in apparent fervent prayer. One group among the mob called themselves a Jericho March, Christians blowing shofars, praying to bring down the walls of government. And there's just so many things wrong with Christians blowing shofars at a mob of violence. Perhaps most appalling for many people of faith was Trump's appeal for millions of Christians whose stated values of honesty, fidelity in marriage, humility, charitable speech, and a spirit of forbearance are the exact opposite of all that the former president represents. But Trump had tapped into a deep and broad reservoir of resentment and paranoia that had been accumulating for decades, a large pool of Christians who feel they are being persecuted and are called by God to rise up and defend themselves against their enemies. And not only must they regain equal footing with others in society, many believe, but they must dominate and be in control. And all this in the blessed name of Jesus. This growing movement of desperate would-be Christian conquerors is referred to as Christian nationalism. A common belief among Christian nationalists that there has been a woeful decline of America's standing in the world because of the nation's growing degeneracy, and with it a concomitant belief in an urgent call to restore the nation to its original goodness and a mandate to lead the world in godliness. Therefore, God has withdrawn his blessing, I use that pronoun intentionally, from America because, like the ancient Israelites, she has fallen into profligacy and a violation of God's laws. The United States was founded, according to this group, by evangelical Christians, based on a misunderstanding and a misreading of the more complex history of the framers of the Constitution, and had God's special mandate to become a new Jerusalem in which white Christians, mostly male, will rule over a nation whose laws are perfectly aligned with their own selective fundamentalist reading of biblical mandates. In their interpretation of apocalyptic scripture, many, especially a wing of Christian nationalism called dominionists, see an avenging Jesus coming to wage spiritual warfare against the current decadent ways of America and the world. Those who hold such views see a growing depravity of the current age as evidence that the end of times is near, and it is their duty to help bring it about. Christian nationalist preachers exhort the faithful in sermons and song to, quote, take this nation back, even by force if required. I believe we're at a pivotal moment in the American experiment of democracy and also in the very character of American Christianity. The very term Christian nationalism really means white nationalism and stands opposed to virtually everything taught in Christianity or Judaism about justice and compassion. Grim prognosticators have spun out scenarios in which the insurrection on January 6th was just the beginning of an attempt to undermine the core of democracy, exemplifying what historian Richard Hofstadter identified as a long-standing paranoid style in American politics. Many people, especially those who were not on the side of the insurgents on that day, are asking, how can people, even those we consider to be good people, get caught up in such a web of lies? Moreover, how can Christians who claim to believe in love, mercy, justice, and truth participate in a movement that is founded in lies, fueled by white supremacy and masculinism, and even far-fetched conspiracy theories, while ignoring or even condoning its inherent propensity toward violence? There are no universal answers to these questions, but in my book, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, I've tried to open some possible pathways to dialogue across the current polarization. So chapter 1 lays the groundwork, exploring the question, what is Christian nationalism, and who are the Americans who subscribe to it? The main tenets of white Christian nationalism are that God established the United States as a Christian nation, and therefore it should essentially be a theonomy, which means rule of laws, shaped by Christian values, as interpreted under an alliance of conservative Christian leaders and right-wing political activists, and also a theocracy ruled by religious leadership, characterized by the headship of men over their households and white male leadership in the public square. Christian nationalists therefore oppose the separation of church and state, rather advocating for the display of Christian symbols in public spaces and explicitly Christian prayer in schools and civic gatherings. Now, just to contrast this, many Black church Protestants who also align Christian values with politics, but to gospel-grounded social and political action for change, whereas white Christian nationalist agenda is almost entirely opposed to what we would consider social justice. White Christian nationalists oppose generous immigration policies to keep out what Trump called drug dealers and rapists, as he infamously said, and to keep out Muslims and other non-Christians. They oppose all abortions, even in cases of rape and incest. They oppose expanding the rights of women and LGBTQ persons. And in a long chain of history, beginning with the utterly denied genocidal founding of the nation, they oppose civil rights legislation and embrace laws that perpetuate structural and institutional racism against Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Some even believe that eco-justice and addressing climate change is moot because the apocalypse is coming and this world will be destroyed anyway. Lest we conclude that this is a fringe movement involving only a small percentage of American Christians, statistics show that nearly 2/3 of mainline Protestants, that in the United States means the traditionally liberal, moderate churches such as Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists, and so forth. So nearly 2/3 of mainline Protestants and 2/3 of all Christians taken together agree with many of the beliefs, if not the actions, of those who participated in the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. Sociologists Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry conducted a large-scale study in which they show some of the following statistics, which I find surprising in the size and scope of Christian nationalism in the United States. So 52% of Americans agree with some or all Christian nationalist beliefs. And in a new survey just published called the Everyday Crusade, they range it from 47 even to as high as 71%. 88% of Christian nationalists are white evangelical Protestants. McDaniel and all put that at 74%. And then among evangelical Protestants, 80% agree with Christian nationalism. 3/4 of those Americans who disagree with Christian nationalism are non-Christians. Half of those are unaffiliated, and about a third, a little over a third, belong to other religions. 60% of what I call true believers and 37% of soft Christian nationalists who don't agree with all of the tenets believe, quote, non-Christians create immoral policies, versus just 11% of those who disagree in the McDaniel study. The most hardcore or true believers or diehard true believers live mostly in the South. They have the lowest formal education and economic status, and they are overwhelmingly evangelical Protestants. And they tend to be a little bit older than other demographic groups. And the religious beliefs of these true believers, 94% overwhelmingly believe in God without any doubts at all and hold the Bible in high esteem. Note that in the Whitehead study, this doesn't correlate with greater church attendance, but that finding was disconfirmed by McDaniel. So it's somewhat unknown how many of these diehard, self-proclaimed Christian nationalists are actually involved in a church community, or are they simply consuming religious fervor through media, TV, and rallies in the public. And then the soft Christian nationalists who are not wholly convinced of all Christian nationalist beliefs. About a third are evangelical Protestants and a third are Catholic. 13% are mainline Protestants and 9% are Black Protestants, which is only a subset of 0.9% of Americans overall. About 2/3 are white. Women slightly outnumber men. And this group tends to live equally in the South and in the Midwest, mostly in towns and suburbs. And again, about 3/4 believe in the Bible as the absolute word of God and revere it. A vast publishing empire and online Christian family content, such as James Dobson's decades-old focus on the family, also promotes Christian nationalist ideas as part of its campaign to promote traditional patriarchal family and to indoctrinate children into a melding of religion, right-wing patriotism, and a conservative, God-honoring definition of Christian family life. Even political rallies are now awash in so-called Christian music. And this just came out in the news this week. Michael Flynn, who was pardoned by Trump for lying to the FBI, which is a crime, is now leading a national Great Reawakening tour to recruit what he calls an army of God, blending alt-right politics, Christian rhetoric, and QAnon conspiracy theory at $500 a ticket, and even offering baptisms in a big metal tub, which, as a priest, I have to say I find rather blasphemous. Several Christian-identified law schools curricula are explicitly designed to send out an ever-increasing cadre of graduates to strengthen the influence of conservative Christian beliefs on the practice of law, the judiciary, and national government. A secretive Christian right legislative campaign called Project Blitz, sponsored by the Congressional Prayer Caucus and other right-wing Christian groups since 2017, has pushed its model bills through state legislatures and has an annual playbook for dominionist legislative strategy. And we're now seeing the fruits of this work in the spread of draconian anti-abortion bills and a proliferation of anti-LGBTQ laws in state legislatures across the country, and heated debates in local schools and libraries about banning books, including attacks against sex education materials as pornography, and against something called social emotional learning, a more holistic pedagogy that may merely allude to the necessity of racial and sexual equality, and also opposing teaching critical race theory, which most of its opponents distort and do not even understand. And most dramatically, the recent Supreme Court decisions overturning Roe versus Wade and reinforcing the right to carry guns and to pray at a public school sports event show the fruits of this legislative underground campaign's work. Let me be clear then. Christian nationalism is a fanatical, radical departure from the teachings of Jesus and any faithful reading of the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, and it is also dangerously anti-democratic. So in chapter 2, that is all just background to give you the lay of the land. And I will say that even my own, when I started this research, I did not realize the extent and the depth of it. Mm-hmm. It really penetrates all aspects of American civic life in ways that were surprising even to me. And so now in chapter 2, that's the psychology chapter. How and why do people get hooked by demagogues and conspiracy theories? What is the psychology behind people's vulnerability to being captivated by false teachings, both religious and political, and their personal investment in maintaining these beliefs, both consciously and unconsciously? So first, I identified 4 conscious motivations behind adherence to Christian nationalist ideas, and there may be more. First of all, evangelization fulfills the need for belonging and a sense of purpose. It's heightened by the religious appeal to join in a cosmic battle between good and evil, with tactics that are similar and at times nearly identical with cult recruiting. And I don't have time to elaborate on all of this, the tactics of cult recruiting and the similarities, but I go to some of our experts on cult recruiting in the book. Secondly, the fear of loss of white social status and a desire to maintain white supremacy, resentment against a perceived, although still quite minimal statistically, a loss of jobs and economic power to immigrants and people of color, and a desire to maintain or regain white supremacy and white power in the face of an actual reality that the US Census Bureau now says by the year 2042 will mark the end of a white majority population in the United States. This fear is explicitly the Great Replacement theory against Jews that was promulgated in the Nazi era, openly embraced now by some white male extremist groups today in the US. A third element is the fear of loss of patriarchal authority and a desire to maintain a masculinist hierarchy. So it goes together with the focus on the family, in the home, Christian evangelicals' belief in male headship, and in the public sphere of work and governmental power. And then finally, the irrational allure of conspiracy theories such as QAnon actually captivates 1 in 5 Americans overall, according to recent surveys, and 1/4 to 1/2 of evangelical Christians believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory. Unconscious motivations involve insidious unconscious pulls of group psychology going back to Sigmund Freud's prescient analysis of groups in 1921, and parallels between Christian nationalism and the power of cult-like groups and their narcissistic leaders to make and amplify false claims, including both in the mainstream and in social media. The power of group persuasion was long known by psychologists throughout history. And I believe that Freud's group psychology is as relevant a description today as it was in his own time to describe the symbiotic psychological bond between followers and their idealized patriarchal leaders, a symbiosis that psychologists have variously called mass hypnosis, mutual intoxication, and the spell cast by persons, the nexus of unfreedom. Now, Freud's breakthrough in 1921, on the heels of World War I, was to recognize the power of a narcissistic leader and the ways in which followers unconsciously hand over their individual conscience to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever they perceive as lacking in their lives. Such leaders exude a fusion of power and erotic potency that men can merge with at an unconscious psychic level and women can admire. How relevant is this to the rise of right-wing strongmen leaders like Trump and the bloody dictators across the globe that Trump still emulates and praises, as in his praise for Putin after the invasion of Ukraine, which was shockingly amplified by a large number of Christian evangelicals? Freud, as most of you will know, was not the first psychologist to study groups and to recognize that when people join a group, they begin to participate in a social dynamic that transcends individuals' particular attitudes, even to the point of sacrificing their own personal morality and capacity for critical thinking. Freud drew heavily in his group psychology on the late 19th century work of Gustave Le Bon, whose treatise, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, laid the foundations for the study of groups, especially mass movements. Le Bon's work, like Freud's, was prompted by experiences of war, in Le Bon's case, the Franco-Prussian War, and its devastating economic aftermath, including a short-lived anti-authoritarian revolt in Paris in the 1870s. Le Bon identified a collective mind that takes over members of a group and which can give permission to individuals, as quoted by Freud, to, quote, feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation. Le Bon believed that under the pressure of a group, characteristics of individuals would come to be submerged in a larger group unconscious that tapped into a common human disposition, maybe a little bit like Jung's later articulation of a collective unconscious. Freud approvingly quotes Le Bon again: the individual forming part of a group acquires, solely from numerical considerations, a sentiment of invincible power which allows him to yield to instincts which, had he been alone, he would perforce have kept under restraint. He will be the less disposed to check himself from the consideration that a group being anonymous and in consequence irresponsible, the sentiment of responsibility which always controls individuals can disappear entirely. Freud continues, citing Le Bon, that a form of contagion arises in groups similar to hypnosis. The group contagion or suggestibility can induce individuals to take actions that they would not necessarily take as individuals. Freud also agrees that in groups, people regress. They lose touch with their most highly developed thinking capacity and begin to behave in accordance with primal drives. Quote, spontaneity, violence, ferocity, and also enthusiasm and heroism. He quotes the German poet Schiller: everyone, when viewed as an individual, is quite astute and mature. When in a group, they become stupid. And the original German word there is Dummkopf. Freud adds that a group is more likely to think as young children do, in images rather than words and concepts. So agreement with reality, he says, is never checked by any reasonable agency. Freud said the feelings of a group are always very simple and very exaggerated, so that a group knows neither doubt nor uncertainty. So it's easy to see how today, if images are at the forefront of this mode of thinking in a group, why social media can reinforce this, since it's a visual world of images, including both photos and videos. Freud goes on to set his general pessimism aside momentarily and allows that groups can be guided by high ideals and not only the most animalistic impulses. Quote, under the influence of suggestion, groups are capable of high achievement in the shape of abnegation, unselfishness, and devotion to an ideal. So what is the differentiating factor that makes some groups constructive in their goals and others so destructive? This is where Freud's own contribution went beyond the observations of Le Bon, which focused mainly on emotional contagion within a group. We might think of it as peer pressure. Freud proposed that the character and aims of a group, whether altruistic or nefarious, also depend heavily on the character and aims of the leader. Freud describes followers to a leader as something more than simple admiration or even the desire to have a relationship with that person, Both idealization and identification are involved. A positive remnant of early identification remains in the form of what has been taken in as a child as good and idealized. Freud called this internal part of the self the ego ideal, which can be a foundation for one's values and the component of the ego related to conscience. And this was before he had developed the tripartite theory of id, ego, and superego. For healthy individuals, identification with another person is an element in forming good relationships. But identification in adulthood, if it is too prominent, can also lead to a regression to a more dependent state of being, as in early childhood, in which the other person's traits, actions, and beliefs are internalized and unconsciously begin to shape and alter one's own identity. This regressive form of identification is often driven by an unconscious sense of lack and a compulsive need to make up for a loss or deficit in early childhood, such as a parent's chronic emotional misattunement, unreliability, frequent absence or abandonment, or even outright abuse. It's precisely this type of regression that Freud sees occurring in groups that become attached to a strong leader. The members of such a group have unconsciously substituted the charismatic figure of the leader for their own individual ego ideals. The resulting bond creates both forceful emotional ties among the members of the group, who all now share a common ego ideal, and a strong bond of loyalty with the leader, who is now a part of themselves. Some of Freud's most speculative and most would say outdated notions come into play in his theory here as well, that the leader is a psychological stand-in for the father and his authority. And since for Freud, these strong emotional ties are libidinal, he also sees the attachment to this leader and to other members of the group as fulfilling a deep instinctual wish disguised in more socially acceptable form. One final element in Freud's observations about this type of leader is the element of narcissism. Freud understood that the psychology of individual members of a group and the psychology of the father figure leader were symmetrical, not identical. The individual still longed for emotional ties with another, but quoting Freud, the father, chief, or leader has few libidinal ties. He loved no one but himself, or other people only insofar as they served his needs. Even today, the members of a group stand in need of the illusion that they are equally and justly loved by their leader, but the leader himself need love no one else. He may be of a masterful nature, absolutely narcissistic, self-confident, and independent. End of quote. Love, says Freud, puts a check on narcissism and as such is crucial to civilization. But the narcissistic leader loves only himself and exploits the love and devotion of his followers only and always for his own benefit, as he sees it according to his whims. Heinz Kohut, as I'm sure you also know, extended Freud's theories on narcissism. Kohut distinguished between pathological narcissism and the healthy narcissism in adulthood that's probably a requirement for successful leaders. For example, possessing reality-based self-confidence and a willingness to be decisive and authoritative, not authoritarian when needed, but not authoritarian. Primary or infantile narcissism only becomes problematic in Kohut's view when the very young child does not receive the mirroring needed at the appropriate time. The admiration, the applause for the one-year-old's first steps. Yay, you did it! The gleam in the parent's eye when the baby achieves a developmental step like walking or talking, and most of all, empathy for who the child really is, as opposed to who the parents want or unconsciously need the child to be. Neglect, disregard, or narcissistic parenting, in which the parent views the child as a psychic extension of himself or herself, rather than promoting the child's own natural personality, interests, and abilities, can result in a depressive sense of emptiness and lack that can persist into adulthood and form the empty hole beneath the bravado of the narcissistic personality. Professor of psychiatry and former CIA profiler Gerald Post perceives that the narcissism of charismatic leaders has its origins in a mirror-hungry personality. Relevant to Christian nationalists, Post notes regarding narcissistic leaders' use of religious rhetoric, two very recent obvious examples. Post says, the invocation of divine guidance and use of biblical references are surely the currency of American political rhetoric, and no politician worth his salt would ignore them. What is the difference between the politician whose use of such rhetoric rings false as hollow posturing and the politician whose religious words inspire? The narcissistic individual who does indeed consciously believe that he has special leadership gifts and accordingly has a special role to play may utilize religious rhetoric much more convincingly. This is also true of the polarization of good and evil, we versus them. In order to be effectively charismatic, it is a great asset, Post says, to possess paranoid conviction. Post believes this mirror-hungry character of the narcissistic leader attracts a particular type of personality as followers, drawing on the other main deficit Kohut identified as a primary infantile need, that of idealization. Thought it was time for a little levity here. All the Chihuahuas want to be a lion, of course. And the idealized parent is someone that when I'm really little, I want to grow up to be like. Kohut believed that a need for both mirroring and idealization are lifelong needs, which are modulated in intensity by healthy development. However, adults can become ideal hungry, in Post's wording, who become especially susceptible to the hypnotic appeal of the charismatic leader. To quote Post again, leaders such as Trump, who convey this sense of grandiose omnipotence, are attractive to individuals seeking idealized sources of strength. They convey a sense of conviction and certainty to those who are consumed by doubt and uncertainty. Trump's motto, "Make America Great Again," had great, strong resonance. Now, I will say this may sound a little bit like blaming the victim. A criticism also leveled at times toward researchers of cults and their recruits, saying that the followers were susceptible because of a particular psychological profile. Post hastens to add that in times of overwhelming stress, adults who would not normally be vulnerable to following a narcissistic leader may also be drawn in. And this may explain, in terms of social psychology, why times of war or economic downturn can make people more susceptible than they might be if they were doing relatively well in their life. Cult expert Margaret Singer further asserts that anyone under the right circumstances can be drawn in by a highly manipulative narcissistic leader. She says, when we hear of individuals being controlled and influenced by others, we instinctively try to separate ourselves from those persons. I would never go for that. Just as most soldiers believe bullets will only hit others, most people tend to believe that their own minds and thought processes are invulnerable. Singer calls this the not me myth, going on to write that, quote, it has become clear over the years that everyone is susceptible to the lure of these master manipulators. And finally, and admittedly, this is the most speculative on my part, trauma studies may add one more insight. Psychological, here's a nice slide for Make America Great Again.
Good shot.
Yeah, not my photo. And finally, admittedly the most speculative on my part, psychological splitting by which good and evil are viewed as absolute opposites is, as we know, a frequent outcome of trauma, whether due to abuse or war or other shattering physical and psychological experience. This might make some individuals more vulnerable to recruitment by cult-like groups and conspiracy theorists. I'm not suggesting that we should assume that all or even most individuals who've experienced trauma would be attracted to groups where fear and paranoia are major emotional features of the group's agenda. Many trauma survivors, in fact, have well-attuned radar for the possibility of emotional re-traumatization in such organizations or movements. Nor should we assume that all Christian nationalists are survivors of abuse or other trauma. But there are some, perhaps even many, in whom a tendency toward psychological splitting would make the extreme worldview of certain groups compelling, especially when a charismatic leader seems to present an all-good idealizable protector. Simple or simplistic answers to big spiritual, existential, or political questions and unambiguous rules of right and wrong can appeal strongly to an all or nothing mindset. A high conformity group with a highly manipulative leader can exploit the victim perpetrator thinking of a trauma survivor by framing everything in terms of good and evil. And it has interested me that a lot of Christian nationalist rhetoric leaps from their own interpretation of the wrathful God of the Hebrew Bible, leaps over the Gospels and jumps right into the book of Revelation, which is the apocalyptic vision. And there's almost nothing in between that we would see as Christians as having to do with gospel values of love and justice, but rather this extreme and catastrophic vision of the end of times. So many survivors, having once seen or experienced evil directly, might not be put off as easily as non-traumatized people by the language of purity versus the demonic, and their own conscious or unconscious desire for justice might stimulate a desire to believe in an imminent cosmic day of reckoning. As trauma survivors, they have already experienced the fire and the ice, especially if such earlier life suffering is deeply repressed and not available to conscious awareness. They may feel a resonance with apocalyptic rhetoric, and they may experience considerable emotional arousal when called to fight whatever or whomever has been named as the enemy. And I did see this in my own clinical experience with trauma survivors, but I will also say it doesn't describe every trauma survivor, and I want to make that very clear. But this may help to answer a question that many commentators posed immediately after the January 6th insurrection. How could so many former and even active duty military and police participate in such a lawless rebellion? How could protesters be carrying distinctive Blue Lives Matter flags on one moment, mixing support for police and strong law and order attitude, and the next moment even using those flags to violently pummel and crush police who were there trying to maintain order? It only makes sense in the unconscious, not in the conscious, rational thinking. Countless military veterans and law enforcement officers have been exposed to horrible events, often many times over, and a strong indoctrination into a military culture of masculinist bravado, which is expected of both male and female police and soldiers, may mask more raw and unacceptable feelings of fear and vulnerability. Bulletproof vests and helmets and armored vehicles may imperfectly protect soldiers' bodies, but there are no bulletproof vests for the psyche. An uncompromising law and order attitude, especially when amalgamated with white supremacy, is as much a symptom of psychological splitting as is a preference to use violence to solve problems, whether in public or private. There are good guys and bad guys. And when the fight is on, whether it is to stop the steal or take America back for God, there is no middle ground. And as Trump said at the rally before the insurrection, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Taking all of this into consideration, and this will be my conclusion, Chapter 3 directly addresses how to talk across the extreme religious and political divide that has emerged from these trends in white right-wing Christian, I can't even say it, white right-wing Christian nationalism.
It rhymes well.
It does. Is it even possible? And if so, how? And if not, what to do instead? Relative power and privilege and the importance of context and timing are the first considerations. So the purpose of this chapter and of my work in this is by no means to create a false peace forged by mainstream appeals to unity, which gloss over the deadly realities of racism and other forms of oppression, and which silence movements for justice and social change. We're not just talking about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The powers of backlash, of white supremacy and patriarchy depend on lies in order to keep an unjust system in place. After spending time in Christian nationalist settings from my research, I've reluctantly come to agree with the assessment of many that Christian nationalists truly do live in an alternate reality. Is honest, open conversation even possible? And in the book, I'm not so much describing how those of us who are therapists might relate to patients clinically, where we might need to maintain somewhat more personal and political neutrality, and that's actually being contested right now in a lot of conversations among therapists, but how anyone can engage in conversation with a convinced person of polar opposite views. Several psychologists have asserted that once people have gone down this rabbit hole of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there is no convincing them of the truth. I disagree. As a therapist, I believe in talk, but under the right conditions. Rather than throwing in the towel, I recommend a triage approach to discern if and when fruitful conversation might be possible and when it should not be attempted. When it comes to a firmly entrenched Christian nationalist, we have to remember that we're trying to dispute not only an individual, but their favorite TV, news network, an ever self-reinforcing bubble of opinion fed to them on social media, through algorithms, sifting through their clicks and likes, and the hundreds or even thousands of members of their church where they just praised Jesus and asked him to save the United States while listening to heart-thumping rock music and indoctrinating sermons. We are trying to talk with QAnon. So argumentation will not work, period. We do need to walk away whenever we perceive that to continue in such a one-sided dialogue will either violate our own personal sense of integrity, continuing to engage with what we consider to be outright hate speech, or causing harm to ourselves because we're allowing ourselves to be subjected to verbal violence. As psychology Bandy Lee has recommended, when dialogue is not possible, engagement in education and advocacy, especially those of us who are professionals who understand something about interpersonal relations, use our expertise for social change. And these are the best ways to channel our own frustration and outrage. When fruitful conversation may be possible, how do we put a toe in the water? There might be a yellow light. Proceed with caution when we sense some openness, as in the case of the soft Christian nationalist who is not wholly convinced by right-wing rhetoric, and where mutual liking and trust are perhaps already established, for example, with a coworker, a neighbor, a skeptical family member, or a friendly acquaintance. The only way in to such a conversation is to show respect and to listen, and not to pounce on an error in their thinking or immediately try to enlighten or heal them, but to try to understand with as much empathy as we can muster what it must be like to be this person and to inhabit their life with its various challenges and stresses. Now, empathy, as you know, is not the same thing as sympathy. It's being able to step into the other's shoes, at least to some meaningful degree, to understand where they're coming from, but it does not have to mean that we agree with them. A green light is still always tentative. I like the left turn yield on green. When it appears that there is some real openness to re-examine convictions, but remember that it can always turn yellow or even red at a moment's notice. So I've outlined a number of recommendations in the chapter for how to engage in such conversation from my experience as a psychotherapist and a teacher of spiritual care. And many of you could write a similar list. I'm not going to go through all of it. But first and foremost, I believe, is that building and maintaining relationship always comes first. And by finding common ground, including shared values and practicing respect and kindness. Much of what I advocate is being non-directive, making I statements rather than universal truth claims, and following the longtime anti-racist feminist activist Loretta Ross, assuming goodwill until proven otherwise, and when confronting, engaging in a process she terms calling in, rather than publicly and self-righteously calling out the person who has said or done something that you find offensive. Being willing to listen and speak publicly, and even to write as professionals about the whole truth of what's happening in America today, is finally, I believe, a form of combating psychological splitting. Recognizing and resisting the very human unconscious temptation to split everything in this Manichaean cosmic battle of good and evil, which is what conspiracy theorists feed on. This requires stamina, It takes courage to weigh both the good and the bad of a relationship and hold them together, regarding them with both mercy and justice. Violence, whether physical or verbal, is never acceptable, but dialogue always has at least the potential to be constructive. One thing honest dialogue requires, perhaps more than anything else, is to do our own inner work of healing the split between our own desired purity and the mostly disavowed evil within ourselves. When we engage in such work, whether through therapy, spiritual direction, meditation, prayer, or other means of self-inquiry, we are far more able, I believe, to withdraw our worst projections that we've placed on another person and enter into genuine dialogue. Now, this is tricky because Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and misogyny are truly reprehensible. That is not merely our fantasy or a neurotic projection. But if we can hold the badness of a conversation partner's beliefs together with a belief, at least in the potential for basic human goodness and rationality, that, as Freud said, where it was, ego might be, then we not only may have the chance to exercise the skill of empathic listening, we may also finally be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for this very enlightening, informative, and also well illustrated talk. I immediately have a couple of things that I'd like to hang on to and discuss with you. By the way, it's, as I think you pointed out already, I think it should be also shown, it's in a nutshell what your book is about, those 3 chapters, those 3 segments of, and ending with what can you do? What can one do as a politically active and also, I would say, therapeutically active person? That's my first thing. You outline a strategy, what can be done, and it seems to me there is this disaster in the making, not just the evangelicals, but we talk about climate change and these other things, and you suggest the approach of empathy, which I guess is never wrong, but it seems to me it's like trying to I don't know, put an end to fire by coming with bits and pieces of water and trying here and there to find some common ground with somebody who's still adding to the fire. My question in this case is how would you describe the role of the media that are also amplifiers of these segregated or bubbles of beliefs in today's United States? The classic media, but also the social media, the fact that there is no regulation, there's not even a fairness doctrine anymore as there used to be until Reagan, I think, more or less, where at least you were supposed to give 2 sides of a story. That's all gone, and the media have gone wild completely, and there's no regulation. There's nobody to say that you have to stop at some point. Isn't that something that kind of hinders any kind of reasonable dialogue?
Well, there's no question that people end up in their own bubbles in the media, and there's this echo chamber effect where people keep hearing what they already believe. There's a thing psychologists call confirmation bias, where you seek out more and more sources that continue to tell you you're right.
That can happen even with a fairness doctrine or anything.
Oh, yeah.
So you can still find your own island.
That's right.
Yeah. What can be done about that?
Well, shout out to my daughter, Dr. Pamela Cooper-White Diefenbach, who actually is now working in the ethics unit of Facebook. Good luck with that. Yeah, well, there is a whole group of people, at least I know this about Facebook, there's a whole group of people who are doing research to try to mitigate false information. And
could I add, as long as it doesn't impinge on the profit of Facebook?
Well, that's one of the frustrations, right?
Just asking.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. But I also think that some of the criticisms of Facebook have been that they completely disregard any notion of what might be ethical, and that's it's too generalized, that there are both forces at work in any corporate environment. I myself, because of things that I've posted that had images, in one case, an image of Hitler and an image of Stalin, lost my Facebook privileges for a week. So some of these things are
The algorithm does.
right.
It
It's
doesn't take into account what you were trying to say.
it's a little bit like killing a mouse with a bomb. But there are people, I just want to say, there are people who are trying to work within the industry to mitigate at least the most blatant falsehoods. And conspiracy theories thrive on falsehoods. And so I think the media is a big issue in all of this because people do find their bubbles, but also I think the failure of the liberal and progressive church to figure out ways to be more public is also at issue, because within evangelical churches and other churches that promote right-wing political thinking, they are very savvy about how to get an audience and how to keep an audience. And I mean, it's a little bit like what people say about Democrats versus Republicans, that if you have a more complex view of things, it's harder to create a soundbite that everybody's going to go repeat. So how do we find a way to communicate that is as compelling as the conspiracy theorists and the demagogues who have found ways to be very compelling?
I just remember a quote by, I think he was a CBS executive, US TV, who in the early stages of the Trump revolution, whatever you want to call it, said, Trump is bad for America, but he's good for CBS, because he raised the ratings. Because it was, as you said, it was about, controversy and whatever, extremism, extreme views, and that kind of fired up the people. That's a devastating statement, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and this comes out of my longtime work in intimate partner violence and prevention, but very often abusers, and I would put these narcissistic strongmen as kind of abusers writ large, tend to know how to lie more convincingly than victims know how to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm. And they tend to stay more in the minds of people who remember the issues. Right. So their side prevails. You mentioned before I don't know exactly your formulation, something like the more progressive evangelicals, that they exist also, but they don't have a voice. I've known for many years, you may know her as a colleague or somebody who works in the field, Marsha Pally. She is at NYU, and for years she has been working on the progressive evangelicals. Mm-hmm. To her, they are a sign of hope, they exist, they are concerned with environment, they are concerned with social justice, etc. And she keeps putting her hope into they will have an impact. And I shouldn't say I make fun of her, but I always say, look, I've read this and that, and it's crazier than ever. Where are you progressive evangelicals? Mm-hmm. She hasn't given up putting hope into them. What's your position on they exist?
Right. Yes. Well, and if 80% of white Christian evangelicals believe at least some of the tenets of Christian nationalism, that means 20% don't. Yeah. Right. So 20% to a quarter of evangelicals is not a small number. Mm-hmm. And there is actually a movement that's coalesced right now. You can look this up on Google, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Mm-hmm. That was actually started in the one of the branches of Baptist church life, the most progressive end of that. And they are very much out there in the media, and they're circulating petitions with thousands of signatures of clergy and lay people. And I was just on a panel actually last night, because of the time difference, with Amanda Tyler, who is the head of that program. Sojourners has been going a long time. That's Jim Wallace's progressive evangelical magazine.
Is it one of the Wallaces, the TV Wallaces? No,
Wallis. Mm-hmm. Jim Wallace founded Sojourners in Washington, D.C., and many people subscribe to their journal, which is written in a very accessible way. So those forces are there. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's up to those of us who are doing this work to amplify those voices and to get them out into the public spaces, because we've tended to be too reticent as liberal Christians about doing that.
Meaning not being outspoken enough, not being media savvy enough.
Yeah.
Well, the media savviness is something that I think, especially for Europeans, but maybe not only, is something that is especially fascinating in a negative way. These mega churches, the televangelists, these very open, out in the open public speakers and charismatic figures. Most of which end up in some kind of sex scandal, which I find also kind of amusing in a not very funny way, right? I mean,
well, it's absolutely parallel, and I mean, a lot of my work previously has had to do also with clergy sexual misconduct.
Yeah.
With a narcissistic leader who only wants no.
Catholics as well.
It's pretty much everywhere in every religious tradition
where
too.
There are authoritarian relationships.
Exactly. So if you have a narcissistic leader,
Not just religion.
And not just religion either.
no, of course. But there
that
is,
happens to be the topic.
right. There is something though to someone who exploits his position as a representative of God,
A mentor.
and a mentor and all of that.
Especially God, of course.
It's completely in line with the rest of it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was going to respond to something else that you said a moment ago, and now I've lost my train of thought.
Televangelists.
Yes. Okay. Televangelists.
You know what the televangelists are, right? This television evangelists. So, you know.
Yes. Well, if you look at some of the programs, which I did for the book, it's not my daily fare. There's a lot of yelling and a lot of very soft speaking. And if you listen to the way that Trump modulates his voice, sometimes he almost sounds bored. There's this way of using the voice that televangelists have figured out that gets people into a kind of, oh, what's he saying? What's he saying? And then boom, there's a big truth that's being said. And then it's followed up by heavily made up women in glittery dresses and kind of stocky middle-aged men who play a Lawrence Welk style backup band, who will then sing something and get everybody up and singing. And yeah, I mean, it's, when you're watching it on TV, you're also seeing an audience of maybe 1,000 people in an auditorium who are already there, you know, doing this. And so, I mean, it just goes against the grain of liberal Protestants to do that. and whereas, I want to say, whereas in the Black church, some of the same methods of preaching and some of the same inspiring, arousing music is happening, but for a completely opposite purpose, which is for social justice, right? Right.
Which leads me to something that I wanted to bring up anyway. I happened to read a few years ago in the New York Times about a Senate race in the state of Georgia. I think it's the U.S. Senate.
Right. It's the U.S. Senate. It's, Raphael Warnock and Herschel.
A guy called Herschel Walker, and the other guy's first name, I don't know, Warnock. You had him on a photo before.
Raphael.
The Social Justice Ebenezer Baptist Church. Yeah. They're both Black preachers. The fascinating thing is the Republican one, Herschel, nice first name, Herschel Walker, is an absolute enemy, foe or enemy of any kind of abortion. He doesn't want abortion under any circumstances, not even rape, not even incest, nothing. So the perfect extremist position. It was found out recently that he told his girlfriend, not his wife, but there's a girlfriend, to have an abortion, and then to have another abortion, which she refused to do, and she went public. But the really interesting thing, I mean, this is crazy enough, but the really interesting thing is what happened later, namely not later, very very shortly afterwards, by his camp, by his followers, in that the way, first of all, they would say that no, that I think is still on the first page. It made first page news, which is probably not a common thing, but here it was, saying one of the pastors defending him compared this Herschel Walker to King David, the ancient Israelite king, and claimed similar I can't read it properly. Sorry, I should have had my glasses here. Similar promise for Mr. Walker that he would be saved by grace because Jesus is behind him. I want to get back to Jesus also, but that's another story.
Okay.
And then his camp gathered, and instead of sort of acknowledging or being silent, where is this second part? I'm sorry. About the misbehaving of Mr. Walker, they counterattacked with television ads saying, and I'm quoting here as it was quoted on TV, this guy, the other one, Warnock, has no problem with aborting babies who are inconvenient. And the worst part, this guy claims to be a Christian. So this is, I mean, so completely insane that to any normal reader, I would say, how can this even happen? How can this continue to happen? And this has been happening. I mean, there was a movie out in 50 years ago about Marjo. You may remember Marjo was this guy who was a young, very successful, so one of these preachers, but in these tents, in these prayer tents in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico. And he grew up, his family was already into this business. And he grew up as a child already like a little like child prodigy, preaching and doing miracles and God knows what. He got sick of it. And he called in a documentary film crew to film the craziness of it while he performed, but with the complicity of the movie company, of the documentary filmmakers, showing how easy it is to get people to give money, to shout amen, to speak in tongues and all these things. And this is 50 years ago. And these things keep happening, that you uncover like Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart and what's his name, Pat Roberts. They're all like liars. They're embroiled in frauds, in sex scandals, in money scandals, in business scandals, and nothing changes. How is this possible?
Well, it goes right back to the issue of narcissism. I mean, as Freud said, if you only love yourself and your own celebrity and your own interests, then none of the rest of it matters, and you'll use other people for your own gratification no matter what.
How come that so many people go along so willingly? I mean, you explained it in part, it's Le Bon, it's Freud, but still, do people never learn?
I think people often do become disaffected over time with these kinds of movements. There are kind of waves with these things, but it's very difficult to admit it once you've been, and this is true of people who are trying to get out of cults as well. And as Margaret Singer says about cults, people of goodwill don't give up on their commitments. And so if you've thrown yourself into this movement and you believed for so long that you were combating evil in the name of God and country, it's really hard to step away from that. But I think people gradually do, and then they become silent. And so it's the loud ones, the voices of the loud cheers, and of course they get amplified by pictures from the media that show the crowds to be bigger than they maybe even are. But I do think, I mean, I hope and pray that there is going to be a downturn of this at some point. But every time we've seen Trump revealed as doing another horrible thing, I remember I thought it was the end of his candidacy when it came out that he talked about when you're a famous person. Well, the Fifth Avenue quote, I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nothing would happen to me. But I was thinking of grabbing the pussy moment. If you don't know about that, Google it. But I thought for sure that would be the end of evangelical support. Yeah. Well, but what that moment did do was that evangelicals took a step, who were Christian nationalists who were supporting him took a step back and took a deep breath, and then they said, well, we're not concerned about the character of the man as much as we are concerned about the policies that he's going to put through. And in fact, that strategy succeeded by putting now a fifth conservative Supreme Court justice on the court. And immediately Roe versus Wade was overturned. The New York law prohibiting guns, concealed carry, and prayer in public schools, all of those things exactly. I mean, there's been 30 years of people working this to happen. And in a way, Trump was opportunistic. He didn't invent any of this stuff. He saw it with his media savvy as a way to become a celebrity as a president by buying this kind of political rhetoric. He himself was pro-life before he was, I mean, pro-choice before he was pro-life. So it was a synergy of a narcissist looking for a stage and a group of people with a strategy looking for someone to move that strategy forward in a charismatic way.
Yeah, he was a liberal when it was cool for him to be a liberal in
Yeah,
New York.
right.
Right.
Which makes you wonder, you know, what his real convictions are at all.
True. Jesus.
Yeah, let's talk about Jesus, yes.
I'd like to start with a quote that I liked a lot. Jon Stewart once said, well, if Jesus were alive today, he wouldn't be allowed in the country. You know, they would stop him at the border. You know, he's a foreigner. He's not a blonde, blue-eyed angel, but he was a Palestinian, basically, we would call him today, or Jewish, Arab, whatever, you know, of those areas. And he was, by all modern American accounts, a leftist. He was against profiteering. He was against hypocrisy. He was all kinds of. How strong, or let's say how present, is that image of the leftist may not be the right label, but of the non-nationalist Jesus who will save America, etc. How strong is that image within the United States?
Well, again, I mean, it goes to the position of liberal and progressive Christians who understand exactly what you just said about Jesus. But it also goes to what I started noticing early on, that these Christian nationalists really do jump from a wrathful God of the Hebrew Bible, which is not the only way Jews would understand God to begin with, to the apocalypse. And the stories of Jesus aren't in there at all. All of those things that Jesus was doing in his time, which had to do with social justice and healing and love.
Everybody relies on the Bible, the people you're talking about. Doesn't anybody really read the Bible, or how is that?
They read it very selectively. It's cherry picking. Yep. I mean, I think all of us who are theologians might cherry pick a little bit, because we look for the bits in the Bible that support our point of view. But I think it's you can't argue with the reality that the overarching effect of the entire Christian Bible, which is the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, moves toward care for the widow and the orphan and the stranger, as you see in Leviticus, and the sick, and that there is a fundamental justice core to the biblical life as it's described. And these people are being convinced to use certain scriptures. I'll give you an example of in my other state. I live in both New York City and in near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where our gubernatorial Republican candidate, Doug Mastriano, who took 3 buses to the January 6th insurrection, by the way, Mastriano's army, he called it. He also is against abortion with no exceptions whatsoever. He went on a long campaign to tell people that they didn't have to wear masks, and that during COVID that they should not have any restrictions because that was the government imposing on people's lives. And his motto is walk as free people. And he puts a scripture reference to the Gospel of John there. It's a complete misreading of what the Gospel of John is framing as freedom. It's not freedom to do whatever I want, no matter what. It's the freedom that comes from being a part of the gospel reality of peace and justice and love. And so
it would have to be explained. It's too complicated.
Right. And so walk as free people is a really nice soundbite. And in his rallies, actually, I mentioned the Mike Flynn rallies. Mastriano is going to be the speaker at the Pennsylvania rally that's coming up. So these folks are also, they know who each other is and they exploit each other's celebrity.
And one maybe last comment, but maybe not. The old saying, follow the money. I mean, there's a lot of material interest. You also in the context of what you mentioned before, that okay, his character may not be perfect, but he is there to advance our cause, and our cause is to gain power. And power also, of course, means money, as has been proven many times, also within the evangelical movement. How strong are the call them, I don't know, business or profiteering or financial motives behind the movers and shakers of the evangelical movement?
Oh, I think they're all about that. Mm-hmm. But it's power for an elite cabal of leaders. It is not trickling down into the membership.
You mean the money or the knowledge of this?
The money.
Mm-hmm.
I think
not a trickle down economy.
No. Okay. There was a very cynical moment back in time. Robert Jones has written about this, where the Catholic church leaders and the even white male evangelical conservative church leaders made a kind of a pact that before then, evangelicals weren't all that head up about abortion, actually. Mm-hmm. But it was kind of like, well, if you will support our anti-abortion movement, then we will give you the heightened status as white church leaders that you are feeling like you're losing if we join forces together. And so it was a very cynical, explicit understanding that that was what they were doing. Mm-hmm. But the rank and file don't know these things for the most part. Related to that, I'll say one more thing, is that a lot of people say, why do poor white rural Americans vote against their own self-interest? Right, why? Well, and I found a very interesting article about that, which is that, first of all, they see Trump as one of them. They believe the lie that he's a self-made man. Yeah. So they see him as someone that they would aspire to be, the Horatio Alger myth. Without the 5 banks. Right. But also, and he tells it like it is, but also because he's brash and because he comes across as decisive and authoritarian, they actually believe his lies that he's going to better their circumstances. Mm-hmm. And what they did not appreciate at all was the sense that East Coast elite liberals, which is also code for Jewish, but that East Coast liberals, and such as Hillary Clinton, calling folks the deplorables. That was terrible. That was a hot mic moment, unscripted. It confirmed for a lot of these folks that Democrats and liberal leftist people look down their noses at them, and they resent that. Understandably, they resent that. So they believe that by backing someone who seems like he's brash and he won't be disturbed by any of that, that he will be their warrior. They believe that they're voting in their own self-interest, even though we might look at the larger picture and think that that's really not true.
And speaking of the East Coast liberals and whatever code that may be, I'm wondering about one thing, and you probably might know. Do people in the Southwest, poorer people, do they get the kind of information that would confirm? I mean, I read the New York Times Style magazine recently, okay? It was about male fashion. It was exclusively flamboyant gay male fashion. It was all gay couples and incredible dressing and so on. And the prices were pants for $1,500, a shirt, I kid you not, a shirt, Zegna, Italy, for $4,150. If a poor guy who makes $4,000 in half a year reads that, don't they get their opinion confirmed that this is a bunch of crazy, not crazy, but despicable, who lost it completely, lost touch with our reality?
Well, I happen to think it's crazy and despicable too.
Anyway, and it's the East Coast, it's New York, which everybody hates anyway. So isn't there, doesn't that get through? Does it get through, or don't they need that?
They don't read the New York Times.
Well, no, of course not. But I'm not assuming they would, but they have channels of people who would say, look what they are doing over there on the East Coast. Or do they? Or do they not?
I think the message is more generally that America has gone to the dogs and is depraved. Mm-hmm. And the bigger concern, they're not looking at fashion spreads. They're looking at the threat that they feel from movements for justice for LGBTQ people. They're very head up right now. I say they, I don't want to overgeneralize, but the people who've gone down the rabbit hole all the way, they see movements for justice for trans children as evil, mm-hmm. And they're preoccupied with basically anti-racism and anti-LGBTQ, and they're also very preoccupied about controlling women's bodies and women's sexuality. Those are the preoccupations. They're not reading the New York Times for the most part, but I think those are the things that keep getting pressed upon by Hannity and by others at Fox News and in the media. What I will say, though, and maybe this is, since we're going to have to wind up pretty soon, another practical thing is, if any of you are ever inspired to write op-eds, mm-hmm. write them for local newspapers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that.
Yes, because somebody who lives in a rural area is not necessarily going to read a newspaper that they say, oh, there's just a bunch of liberals anyway. But they're going to read the newspaper that has their daughter's graduation and their son's football field triumph and who's in the hospital and who died, the obit page. That's where actually the genius of the right wing has captivated people. They've infiltrated school boards and town councils and that grassroots level of government. And so my spouse, Michael Cooper-White, actually, when he retired as a seminary president, started writing for the local Gettysburg Times. And the feedback was amazing. Everywhere we went, they would say, I don't always agree with you, but I really like your writing. And so people read that. They won't read this, but they will read that.
Questions, comments from the audience. It's about time. I've spoken too much. So I know it's hard to be the first one, but maybe there should be a first one. Maybe you have a question, a comment, a differing opinion. Yes, please. Oh, maybe you have one. I was hoping. Okay.
Well, thank you first, Pam, for this brilliant analysis, and I really look forward to reading through it to understand it a bit better again. But one thing that struck me was the thought of the apocalyptic perspective of everything. So now that we're talking for the first time since decades about nuclear Armageddon, I don't really know, but is this possible that those people also think also a man-made Armageddon is a proper Armageddon, or is this a danger that's not really existing?
Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think there were some evangelical Christians who immediately jumped on the Putin bandwagon and said he did the right thing by invading Ukraine. And they were following Trump in that as well. I haven't had a chance to talk to anybody about this in evangelical circles, but I would say in general, they are waiting for the signs that they read as from the book of Revelation, which are dreamlike and metaphorical and taking them literally. So there will be wars and rumors of wars, and there will be terrible environmental events, storms and fires, and there will be wars all over the world. And so they could see this as one of the signs that they're right, that it's coming, and that if you're with God and Jesus, then you're going to get raptured and taken away from all of this, hoovered up into the sky. And the rest of us are going to have to live here radioactively glowing.
There's a series of books.
Oh, the Left Behind series. Yeah.
Hugely successful.
Tim LaHaye, the author of the Left Behind series, also has been involved in some of these grassroots political movements for about 30 some years now. Mm-hmm. And he's very extreme. but there are sort of two ways that even Christians who take the Bible quite literally, there are two ways of thinking about the apocalypse. One is that the post-millennial idea is that Jesus will come again in his own good time. We don't know when. And when he comes, there will be 1,000 years of peace and harmony, and the world will be redeemed. But the premillennialists want to say, we have to bring that about ourselves. We have to take action to bring Jesus' second coming to happen, because he needs to see that we've laid out the welcome mat. And of course, it has to be in the United States. But that's why they're also so strong on the nation of Israel, because one of their beliefs is that Israel has to be restored to its supremacy in the Middle East. However, unless the Jews accept Jesus, they're not going to get raptured. They just have to make Israel strong.
Another thing that Trump exploits.
Yeah, and Mastriano actually has been outed as being on a particular web channel that is explicitly anti-Semitic as well as racist. And anti-Semitism is still alive and well in the United States. And this replacement theory goes straight back to earlier rhetoric about that in the Nazi era.
Did I see your hand?
I think I saw another hand.
Yes. Yeah, two. Oh,
Thank you, Peter.
First, I should like to thank you, Pamela, for the research. So interesting for me, this topic. And in 2019, there were explosion, social explosion in my country, and it was a strong, born and strong movement, Christian movement. What do you think about the inequality in the countries related to this topic?
What's your country?
Chile.
Chile. Oh, okay. Yes. I think that socialism has become so merged in people's minds with Stalinist or Maoist communism, and there's just not a lot of discernment about what the differences might be between those things. And remember, we had years and years of Reagan and his followers. Everything was anti-communist, the McCarthy era. And I mean, you can see the same thing going on in Hungary now, where the Protestant church is like this with the right-wing Fidesz party, partly as a reaction against not wanting to be a communist nation after Stalinist repression. So there's all these histories of back and forth. And I can't comment too intelligently on the current situation in Chile, but I do know that there are Christians who see Jesus's message as being a message of socialism in the sense of distributing wealth and caring for the poor, and that the government should be about doing those things, not necessarily to become a dictatorship on the other side. A leftist dictatorship is still a dictatorship. But because there's been so much splitting and so much anti-communist and anti-dictatorship rhetoric, that it's easy to flip from one to the other and not be able to inhabit a more complicated middle ground, I think.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Pamela.
Is the microphone on? I don't.
Do you? Yes, is that okay?
Just hold it close.
Okay.
You touch a wounded point, something central to our thinking, even if we don't live the same problems here. I share with Pamela that we are theologians and also working in other fields. And because you asked, where are the mainline Christians? Where are those who are not those evangelical nationalists or fundamentalists? maybe we are engaged with trying to find out how to live together as human beings between religions, between religious people and non-religious. And we do this because we think that's our understanding and our instinct of following Jesus. The other thing I do not find so easy is to call those fundamentalists, to allow them to call themselves Christians. They belong to groups which call themselves Christians, but you have asked, isn't that true that Jesus would have had to stay outside the United States? So, yeah. These are not answers, it's a question. Yeah, but it's good that you ask these questions as well. Thank you.
Well, because they self-identify as Christian, and I was at a biker rally for Mastriano on one occasion where I was approaching anybody who was wearing a cross or a big T-shirt with a cross on it, or a picture of Jesus or something, and I asked them the question that I thought would be rather benign of, how do you see patriotism and Christianity going together? And word for word, several people just said, "Oh, it's a no-brainer." And
meaning it's obvious.
It's obvious that, of course, and patriotism isn't the same thing as nationalism. Patriotism is simply love of country, whereas nationalism is wanting a particular ethnic group that they believe are the true members of that country to have power and dominion. So you see these nationalistic movements all over the world, and some of them identify as religious and some of them don't. I don't think we can tell somebody that they're not a Christian if they say they are, but I think we can have conversation about what does that mean, and where in the Gospels, are they finding a message of hope and something that's not leaping right from a wrathful God to a wrathful apocalypse.
No, it's because of, yeah, thank you. No, for sure. So I have worked as a pastor in two congregations here in Austria, where those who were the loudest were fundamentalist evangelical Christians, and they would speak about the others as not being Christians.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't want to defend what I said, but the feeling is, and the other thing is, I teach here at the Catholic faculty ecumenism, and students are asked to visit one other Christian church, and we don't let them visit evangelical fundamentalist groups because they will not be able to learn ecumenism or dialogue visiting those churches, because they would have to learn all those skills you have described before visiting them.
You mean like the empathy?
Yeah, yes. And this might be the other key, that we all might have to learn much more from Freud and psychotherapy, and I don't know, I'm not good at that. That's not my field. But to learn to understand how our brains do work only within the rest of our psyche and bodies, and to understand that we all are vulnerable to, as we said, to extremist ideas. I would have had a different question. Is there hope for narcissists?
With enough years on the couch, maybe, yes.
Thank you so much, Pamela and Michael, for this vivid conversation. I was just about to ask one only question too, but the final question? No question from the Zoom participants? No. So, Pamela, on one slide, you about who are the Christian nationalists, we could read that about slightly more than half are women. And then you did not come back to the gender topic at all. Yeah. Very briefly, anything you could tell about it? Or is there just nothing to say because...
Well, there is something to say, and I want to try to do this concisely. There's a phenomenon, and I think it started with Sarah Palin, of women who style themselves after the masculinist, macho, gun-toting male political figure. And there's been a proliferation of white women politicians now who are doing ads showing themselves holding a machine gun and trying to exude that toughness while also, you know, they're often blonde, wearing makeup, and that this is sort of, it's like buying into a masculinist vision of femininity while being as tough as nails. And this is kind of a new genre. But when I went to the bike rally, I saw a lot of women who would be more in that category. So there is something going on there with some women in the movement. Other women, I think, who are in the movement are dazzled by, frankly, some vicarious erotic desire for the strongman, and maybe unsatisfied in their own relationships or their home life, and others who are just swept up by the fervor of it. And QAnon in particular has been really sneaky about recruiting women by starting out with TikToks and various social media showing how to apply makeup and how to cook better brownies and all of that, and then sort of slipping in. And we really need to be concerned about the children, because
isn't the children a big thing?
Yeah,
They get kidnapped by the white liberals and then sucked dry and stuff like that.
the Democrats. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a new variation on the blood, on the anti-Semitic blood libel, but basically, yes, there's this cabal of Democrats, Hillary Clinton being one of them, Pizzagate,
Yes.
who are abusing children, and they're all Satanists. And I think the hook for women, particularly who might be mothers themselves of small children, are like, well, this sounds pretty crazy, but what if it's true? And what if we ignore it? We can't ignore it because it might be true. And so then they start hearing all these seemingly rational explanations for how the wool is being pulled over their eyes by us. So it's very clever in all of these instances to sort of inoculate the message by saying, of course, those liberals are going to tell you that we're lying, but they're the ones who are lying. So it's complicated. There's not one reason why women join the movements, but there are multiple reasons.
I think the children thing is a big thing. That's how, what I read once is how QAnon gets people into their realm. Is
Yes.
by having groups that are save our children.
Yeah, save our children. Mm-hmm.
Well, on this happy note.
On this happy note.
Do you wanna?
I just would like to say thank you, both of you. I think you gave us, it was an extremely instructive discussion and presentation. You gave us a lot to think about, and I think it was also a votum for ambivalence and thinking in differentiation in order to combat this kind of binary thinking which you were presenting tonight. So thank you.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Giving you the opportunity.
It's always, it feels like coming home, coming back here at the museum, so I'm always glad to be here.
Okay.